But there is a mistake that we cannot make as progressives. We cannot afford to just look back at the past in search for some golden age of international affairs, even if from time to time I obviously miss part of the environment I was operating in different years. Today, the foreign policy debate is too often presented as a clash between two backward-looking options. On one side, there is a reactionary position, the position of those who want to destroy everything that was achieved in these years, go back to a foreign policy based on nationalism and power politics. And this reactionary option has led to probably one of the most violent attacks, if not the most violent attack, against multilateralism and the UN system since its foundation. The alternative to this reactionary position cannot be conservative. The alternative is not to keep the international system as it is. That is the point. A progressive foreign policy is about shaping a more cooperative system for global governance, preserving the achievements of the past, but always at the same time trying to build on them and to move one step forward. At the beginning of my 5 years in office, we Europeans contributed to what has been a moment of true progress in global politics. I would say an expansion phase for multilateralism. Back in 2015 and 2016, we helped build a new wave of multilateral agreements. If you think of the Paris Agreement on climate change, the Sustainable Development Goals under the UN umbrella, the nuclear deal with Iran, we then tried to use the opportunity that was opened up with the Iran deal also to set up a new regional environment and global environment to try to address the Syrian crisis. We established just a few weeks after the nuclear deal with Iran was achieved, the International Syria Support Group. At the time, it was the first time ever that we managed to gather all the relevant international regional players on the Syrian file around the same table. And in the same years, we also worked with all other global powers to revitalize the Middle East Quartet. Seems very long ago, and it is. It was a moment of hope, but after such an expansion phase for multilateralism, a contraction phase has followed. So it is only natural, I believe, that the European Union, Europeans in general, have worked first and foremost to preserve our common achievements, from the Iran deal to the Paris Agreement, with a very strong investment in saving the UN system, first of all, the values, but also very practically, the UN agencies, for instance, that were going through serious budgetary crisis. But we've also tried to reform and expand the system as we preserved the achievements. We have, in some cases, managed to create multilateralism, even in a very difficult environment. Let me just mention 4 ways in which we have tried to defend and transform, to use your own words, the multilateral system. 4 progressive ideas that have shaped our approach to global governance. First, we've always tried to open the space, sometimes create the space for multilateral dialogue, even when dialogue and cooperation seemed to be completely impossible. This is what we have done with the International Contact Group on Venezuela, but also on Afghanistan. We've gathered together from Central Asia to India to Pakistan to Russia and China, the United States, and obviously the Afghans themselves, but also with the Quartet for Libya, where we, together with the African Union, the Arab League, and the United Nations, have gathered forces so that the unity of the surroundings, inshallah, they would say, could have helped the Libyans themselves to unite. We've always worked to find the right multilateral format, to identify who exactly needed to be sitting at the table, using our convening power that is quite exceptional in the world, and sometimes even creating the table, setting the table, preparing the space for different players to sit together and to feel comfortable in sitting together, protected by this convening power that we've put at the disposal of these mediation approaches. Second, the partnership approach. In your recommendations, you mention, and I very much agree with that, the need for a true partnership with Africa And I believe this is really the key. We've moved somehow from the idea of working for Africa, that has been the traditional approach Europeans have always had, to working with Africa. And I think this has made the difference. First of all, of trust and of respect, the recognition of a political partnership, and moving away from the donor-recipient approach. We've tried to put this in practice in all fields, not only on development or humanitarian aid and cooperation, and obviously migration, but also on fields of cooperation that were completely new. I think of digital, well, women empowerment has never been completely new, but we've gave it a push. The role of youth, that sometimes helped also on the gender issues, water, climate issues, connectivity, you name it. And obviously, rule of law and human rights. This is the logic that has driven our work with the African Union, with which I would say today we have more than a partnership, a friendship. And if I measure the distance of even the climate we had in our very first meetings, 2014, 2015, thanks, and the meetings we have today we can call it ourselves and each other brother and sister without any doubt that we're speaking the truth, because we feel we're on the same side and we're tackling issues together. And by the way, there has been a lot of work that has been done also here across the institutions and also across different political party groups to help and accompany that process in a useful manner. So we've done that with the African, bilaterally, with single African countries, and we've done that with the very innovative and very inspiring, and for me it's a model that could be replicated also in other areas, the trilateral format we've established with the United Nations and the African Union. European Union, African Union, and United Nations, putting together their energies and their also political weight to address common challenges. And it is also the logic of our cooperation, for instance, with the G5 Sahel or with other groups of African states, sub-regional organizations. The same logic also applied to many others of our partnerships. Think of Latin America, think of Southeast Asia. A progressive foreign policy, to me, is all about building partnerships and coalitions with those who share our values and our interests. In the global strategy, we say that investing in the strength of your partners, of your friends, also of your neighbors, is a way of strengthening yourself. And I think this has never been more evident than today. And so I come to the third point. A progressive foreign policy is about joining our interests and values. And I remember very well having this conversation with Natalie 5 years ago. We started 5 years ago, and then that part of the conversation continued for, I would say, 1.5 years, whether we had to put first values or interests. And that has been a deep and complicated debate. I believe that our progressive European values do not contradict at all our strategic interests. On the contrary, they somehow serve each other, they support each other, they go together. Protecting human rights is obviously the key value for us. I say obviously, but sometimes it's not so obvious. It should be. And it is also essential for sustainable peace and security. This is also another concept on which we've worked so much at the times of thinking the global strategy. We've worked, the international community has developed the concept of sustainable development, and it took long. Why don't we work on sustainable peace and security? Because security is not only the security angle. What makes a society secure is also the sense of ownership and belonging that citizens feel in their own communities. And that concept of having a sustainable security is probably what indicates at best how values and interests can join. You can impose security on a community, but if you want a sustainable security to be there, you need to empower, you need to create spaces for civil society to grow. So fighting inequalities all across the world, protecting workers' rights, creating opportunities for women, for young people, more and more, for minorities, protecting the environment, fighting global warming. These are values, and our values for sure, but they're also vital strategic interests of the European Union. And thinking that the values are opposed to the interest and vice versa is definitely not serving the effectiveness of our work. So whenever we have shaped, for instance, a new investment plan, And I think of the External Investment Plan for Africa, the most massive investment plan we have ever created in the European Union. We've put sustainability, education, and women's rights at the core of our policy. Not just because it's right, but also because it's what works better to achieve sustainable development and sustainable security. And whenever we negotiated a new trade deal, we've always made it a free and fair trade agreement. We've always included clauses on workers' rights, food safety, environmental protection. We've put our values into the mix, trying to give a heart to our very cynical word. Finally, a progressive foreign policy is not just about a restricted group of diplomats or foreign policy experts. You need that, but in this century, in these times, I believe a progressive foreign policy needs to be inclusive, needs to be open, needs to be a dialogue with all sectors of society. The core element of our idea of multilateralism is to make diplomatic processes inclusive and representative. So decisions become not only more democratic, but also the implementation effectually and really starts, and any agreement can better stand the test of time. Multilateralism is about bringing more voices to the table, and it goes beyond governments, institutions, international organizations. And here again, I remember the discussions we had when we talk about multilateralism. It's not only multilateralism of institutional actors and players, but it's also the difference of actors and players you have to bring into the process. And I'm particularly proud, for instance, of the work we've done with the UN to bring women to the negotiating and mediation tables all across the world. And I think of Syria, Colombia, Yemen, Afghanistan, trying on Libya, more difficult, but a constant effort to empower women, not just because their voice needs to be heard, but because they have a powerful contribution to make, not just victims, but as those that can help and contribute solving the problem, especially when it comes to conflicts. Because normally they have not been fighting, and they contribute better to find a solution without having the sense of losing, which is one of the most difficult elements you need to take into perspective when you negotiate a mediation. If diplomacy is conceived just as a great power game among nation states, it fails. It's not a matter of good sentiments. It simply doesn't work. Simply because our world today is much more complex than it was ever in the past. The point in today's world is not just having two signatures on a piece of paper, or having two strong men, and it's often men, shaking hands in front of the cameras. They can shake hands, but then you need global power than the European Union today that stands for this progressive approach to foreign policy. So we have a responsibility. If we want to protect and advance the idea of a more cooperative global governance, we need Europe to take on its responsibility as a global power and a global point of reference. The rest of the world already sees us this way. I often wonder if Europeans see themselves this way. We have an issue with self-perception that we need to tackle. This is also part of our strategic autonomy. As you explain in your paper, strategic autonomy obviously requires the capacity to act autonomously when it comes to military action, when necessary, always in a multilateral framework. I want to stress this. But strategic autonomy is also about something that goes beyond military action. It's about our ability to shape the rules of the international economic system. It's about having an independent and principled trade policy. It's about raising international standards in all fields, from having a strong use of our own currency, the euro. So it's all issues that are not necessarily proper traditional foreign policy issues, but in the world of today, no issue is purely domestic. Everything has an external and global projection that can be used from the European Union to build a more recognizable and even assertive role in the world. Not because we want to win a fight, but because others in the world need us to be there to somehow avoid being lonely in a difficult fight. No European nation state can do this alone, and I think this is quite self-evident today. It was not self-evident 5 years ago. It is self-evident today. But together as European Union, I believe we have the power to be global shapers. Nobody else has that power more than the Europeans. If we recognize this power, if we see this power, and if we decide to properly use this power. Thank you. Can I sit now, Natalie? Thank you.